Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about Allied military intelligence during the First World War, the networks of spies that existed in Belgium and Netherlands, particularly, which monitored troop movements and trains effectively and gave the British and the French some of the best indications as to future German plans. So today we're reading from With Our Backs to the Wall, Victory and Defeat in 1918 by David Stevenson, which, as I've mentioned before, is one of the best accounts of the final stages of the First World War. And David Stevenson writes that the final Ludendorff offensives, Michael, Blucher, York, and the others, in the spring of 1918, didn't quite catch the British off guard. The British were aware that something was in the offing because they were able to look at the movement of forces to the front. They were able to keep a close eye on how the German army was moving its troops around. However, much of the actual timing of the offensives, the strength of them, and their leadership and intentions do catch the Allies unawares. There was some indication, though this has obviously been kept a tightly guarded secret for the last century, as to British and French penetration of Germany itself in terms of intelligence and informants within Germany. But the real successes for the Allied powers in terms of intelligence came from agents in occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. David Stevenson writes, most significant was the Allies' train watching system in occupied France and the Low Countries, to which the Germans had no counterpart. It tracked the movement of infantry and artillery, and especially that of constituted units, i.e. whole divisions, which typically required 40 trains each to move. Train watching in Belgium began early, much of it done by returning refugees who worked for a profusion of networks run by the British, French, and Belgian intelligence. Competition and non-cooperation led several agents to disaster, as did insecure communications, secret documentation being carried by courier from Holland to Britain on a steam packet and intercepted 3 times by boarders from German warships during 1916. So this is in keeping with the other stuff that we've looked at so far on the beginnings of military intelligence and the beginnings of MI6 and MI5, and the degree of amateurism. And I don't mean that in any kind of particularly negative way, but quite literally the lack of any real professional understanding of military intelligence, particularly at the scale required during a period of total war. The development of intelligence, particularly British intelligence, throughout the 20th century has been quite a bloody affair. If you look at the scale of losses to the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War, the numbers of agent networks rolled up by the Germans and summarily executed, it's fair to say that British intelligence learned through its errors. For example, by 1917, all British reports from the Netherlands were directed for editing via the military attaché in The Hague, Lawrence Oppenheim. During the war, the British had 130 networks in Europe with 4,360 agents. The French had 40 networks with only 650 agents. And the Belgians 25 networks with 500 agents. The Americans, when they joined the war in 1917, are keen to become involved in the intelligence gathering business. They have plenty of money to spend and often poach the informants who the British or the French or the Belgians have cut their ties with, or who can be bought for a higher price and lured away. So these are often not high-grade sources of information or high-grade candidates. And their cultivation by the Americans takes a sufficient time that the Americans don't really have during the war in April 1917 and the war ending in November 1918. And Britain's operations were run by the new organisation MI6, led by Sir Mansfield Cumming in Whitehall, in the Netherlands controlled by a South African captain, Henry Landau. Landau's operation was known collectively as La Dame Blanche, or the White Lady, which was named after a kind of like a myth of a ghost whose sighting would always presage the death of a Hohenzollern, the dynasty that the Kaiser was born of. By 1918, La Dame Blanche had observers all over Belgium, and the British organised groups that were run from London tended to dominate northeastern France. This area was really, really important. It was the sector where the lateral railway passed behind the German front and skirted the Ardennes. So if you're wondering about looking about at troop movements and railways, there's probably nowhere more important in the war to have observers than northeastern France. From February 1918 onwards, General Headquarters was able to establish a reporting service at the eastern end of the line in Luxembourg, whose messages reached Paris in 5 days instead of 3 weeks via the Netherlands. And they did this via a code that communicated details in a local newspaper, De Landwehr. Its contents seemed pretty innocuous, pretty innocent, and so much so that the Germans permitted the newspaper it to be exported to Switzerland. And De Landwehr became a crucial source of information for the British. During the war, GHQ had at least 6,000 agents and informants across occupied Europe on the payroll, of which 98 were caught and executed, and a further 644 were thrown in jail. A third of those who worked for Landau's network, La Dame Blanche, were women. Its recruits came from all social classes. Some were members of the aristocracy, all the way down to members of the working classes, railway workers, barge pilots, peasants, priests and nuns. Among the Catholic Church in France, Belgium, and other kind of Catholic denominations in the Netherlands, the memory of the destruction of Louvain in 1914 in France, one of the first great casualty of German aggression, resonated deeply. But this kind of intelligence gathering was the first phase of the building of the intelligence picture. The creation of units that would, or networks that would focus on particular German divisions in order to try to build up a picture of their force strength, capability, equipment, and auxiliary forces, worked very well. But this information, when it came back to the British intelligence, then had to be verified in order to kind of sharpen up the focus on the information and to build a more detailed and accurate picture. Prisoner and deserter interrogation was one of the most useful methods of doing this. Taking the information picture, intelligence picture that had already been created by the informants, and then probing to test whether it was accurate with informants, with prisoners and deserters. The British had done this particularly well by 1918, and Allied prisoners also gave their German captors particularly accurate information. David Stevenson writes, a shot-down pilot on the 18th of March, followed the next day by prisoners and by two deserters, one Polish and one Alsatian, confirmed that the Michael attack would come on the 20th or the 21st. The intelligence corps officers, who were often trained linguists, found questioning was best done during the shock and disorientation immediately following capture, and was more productive with non-German minorities and private soldiers than with NCOs and officers. A relaxed and friendly approach worked better than threats or intimidation, and returned prisoners might be placed with other captives as stool pigeons. If nothing else, prisoner and deserter intelligence could confirm the identification of the units on the opposite side of the line, and might also illuminate morale and the political conditions in Germany, although by 1918 GHQ had become more cautious about such information after the excessive optimism of Edgar Cox's predecessor as Haig's intelligence chief, John Charteris. Charteris's predictions that the war would cause Germany to grind to a halt and to sue for peace turned out by early 1918 to not be the case. And when this actually does happen, when Germany is brought to its knees by a working class revolution, which is what finally ends the First World War, then that comes to the British as something of not necessarily a surprise. It was clear that Germany was losing the war, but the outbreak of revolution isn't something that the British predicted or were able to preempt in any way. When Operation Michael, the biggest blow against the British lines during the Ludendorff offensive, when that began, the German army had become wise to the threat of loose-lipped deserters, and the German army had made sure that private soldiers knew as little as possible about the possibility, about the plans for the attack before it began. The other form of intelligence gathering on the front was, of course, air reconnaissance. Air reconnaissance dramatically changed throughout the war. It developed, it was seen as by something of an irrelevance, particularly by the British Chiefs of Staff in 1914, until it starts actually proving itself. British generals often began from a standpoint of conservatism with a small c about military strategy and scepticism about new innovations, particularly those that were kind of almost new service arms, such as what would eventually become the RAF, as they saw these as encroachments on their own areas of expertise and perhaps their own sense of power and prestige. But the usefulness of air reconnaissance rapidly becomes invaluable. In 1914, air reconnaissance had traced German marching columns through Belgium, and the movement of the German First Army away from Paris to the south, which brought about the first Battle of the Marne, which was Britain and France's first victory of the war. This made air power a significant factor in the defence of Paris in 1914 and the prevention of a lightning victory for Germany by the late summer, early autumn of 1914. Trench warfare, of course, meant that intelligence gathering was significantly more difficult. Being able to find out what the enemy was doing had to come from forward listening posts, from night reconnaissance raids, from capturing prisoners from enemy lines, all sorts of very, very hazardous stuff. So in this regard, having aircraft was a very valuable tool. So what the aircraft becomes initially is a mobile camera station the way that we would use drones now in the 21st century. Air reconnaissance was able to observe dangers developing in the spring of 1918 before the Ludendorff offensive. It was able to observe German building projects opposite the British Third Army. And this had been how Germany had been able to observe the British build-up before the Battle of the Somme. The British had believed that they had kept their railway building up to the Somme front line secret, but they hadn't. They had been spotted by German aircraft, and the Germans spent a great deal of time digging concrete bunkers that would protect them, protect their soldiers, for the most part, from the biggest British artillery barrage of the war up until that point. The British were unlucky in that before the outbreak of the Michael offensive, there were 3 to 4 days of heavy cloud and rain, making it very difficult to gather intelligence from the skies. And all the Germans had been wise enough to camouflage their forward positions. They had been wise enough to cover the tracks of their vehicles and do most of their planning and preparation and troop movements by night. In the field of cryptanalysis or decoding, the French had really pioneered ahead. The French, as a defending army, tended to use France's cable network using telegraph. The German army, not being able to bring a telegraph system with them, obviously, used radio. And so in 1914, the French army was able to establish a unit that could listen to German radio transmissions and crack the codes that were being messaged back and forth. The British War Office had to be more improvising in its approach to signals intelligence, not being as advanced as the French, but quickly began to assemble linguists and code breakers. In contrast to this, writes David Stevenson, Germany had made few preparations for a war of ciphers, and for much of the conflict was at a disadvantage. Cryptography, the art of encrypting, still more cryptanalysis, the art of decoding, was an exacting craft that required months of dedicated training and practice. It took a while to come into its own, as once trench warfare set in, both sides relied less on radio than on cable and on field telephones. In 1916, the Germans and the French had devised equipment for listening in on conversations in the opposing trenches, and the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, which was lax about security, owed many of its grievous losses on the Somme to German eavesdropping. Subsequently, new precautions were ordered that improved matters, though to the end the British were often careless. As the German front line established itself, the German trench network from the Channel coast all the way to the Alps, the Germans quickly built the communications infrastructure using cable and telegraph. This was phased out within 2 years. After 1916, the German army shifts to radio as its way of communicating at all levels. And this was partly due to the lack of rubber and non-ferrous metals needed to make cables, and partly due to the fact that Allied artillery could blow apart cable networks very easily during the first bombardment, making the possibilities, making it very difficult to coordinate armies at all following that. Radio messages were much more easy to be intercepted, however, so they presented uses and problems. The French were able to build an array of receivers that would intercept messages and they and the British became very, very skilled at reconstructing German order of battle instructions by looking at the analysis of radio traffic. Even when it was difficult to know precisely what a message said, it was still possible to predict where a unit was and what its composition was by looking at familiar call signs and looking at the volumes and direction of wireless messages. So if a particular unit was receiving an awful lot of traffic, it normally meant it was a big and insignificant one, and you could make educated guesses as to which one it was. And if you had been able to associate a particular call sign with a particular regiment or division, then it was even easier. Before the Michael offensive, the German army, having remembered the problems of 1914 and the kind of the chaos in terms of communications as the German army raced across France, were able to kind of outthink the enemy. The Germans introduced the ADFGX field cipher, which was easy for them to use and was the most complicated and difficult code so far seen in the history of intelligence at that point. The Allies were unable to break the code, and the Germans had also learned the Allies' trick of being able to work out information from call signs. So they began to use dummy call signs. They also started to create false intelligence traffic, indicating that there were units in certain places that obviously that weren't there. And so this helped the German army to create the illusion of a phantom army in the Champagne region. This confused the French for days, and the Allies were deceived. The kind of deception, the kind of misdirection that the Allies eventually use in the Second World War against the Germans using Operation Fortitude just before the D-Day invasions. During April and May, the Allies' intelligence situation got better, though only a little bit. The British Expeditionary Force did have a warning about the third attack on March the 28th, the Mars attack, which is one of the reasons why it was defeated and why the Ludendorff offensive starts to gradually peter out. The General HQ at Leeds was surprised by the timing and location of Mars, which started just as Britain's allies, the Portuguese, were being moved out. So it really came at a very, very bad time and created a kind of, at a moment when there was a gap in the line. Ground and air observation on the 7th of April saw the preparations, but intelligence at General Headquarters still thought that the main attack would come along the La Bassée Canal. During the battle, the weather made Allied overflights really, really difficult. And so for the first few days of Operation Mars, as during Operation Michael, GHQ, General Headquarters, was shifted from a kind of an aura of complacency to one of panic, that something approaching a massive German breakthrough was about to happen as the scale of the attack became clear. So the British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians, all show themselves to be quite inconsistent in the arena of intelligence gathering during the war. Some operations, some capabilities like France's ability to decrypt German codes and to gather German signals intelligence are really impressive. But there are a number of unnecessary failings and errors along the way, and carelessness on all sides, but particularly at the front line on the part of the British. this underlines the point that kind of the development of intelligence is a bloody affair, not for those just for those intelligence networks that are rolled up, but for the calamities that befall men at the front line when intelligence is missed, ignored, or when deception operations are successfully perpetrated on either side. So we'll look at David Stevenson's work on battlefield innovations a little bit more in the coming weeks. But I hope you find this useful and interesting, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thank you. Bye-bye.